clear for launch. And with that, shut down your visors, O2 on, and prepare for ignition, 202. EPP, copy that, and
Hi, I'm Mr. Rushoff. All right, so in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about how you can use studying skills in order to be successful in the classroom. In particular, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how you can use notes when you're doing your textbook reading and when you're watching your videos or your lectures, and then how you can use those notes in order to study. Now, the first thing we need to look at is how do we actually learn? And learning obviously has a lot to do with memory. And a guy that did a lot of research on memory back in the 1800s was a guy by the name of Hermann Ebbinghaus. Now, Ebbinghaus was trying to determine what was the relationship between memory and time. Essentially, he was trying to determine how fast do you forget things over time. And what he found was what he called the forgetting curve. See, 20 minutes after you get done watching this video, what he found is you're probably only going to remember about 60% of the information I'm talking about. Within an hour, that number is going to go down to less than 45%. In a day, it's about 1/3. And over 31 days, you're only going to remember about 20% of the information. Now, you might say this was all done back in 1885, but the same type of studies that Ebbinghaus has done has been replicated time after time after time with nearly the same results. So the challenge in learning is how can you remember more and more of the information you learn in the classroom over time? And the key word to that is called repetition. Repetition is essentially repeating something that has been already said or seen. See, what Ebbinghaus also realized was that every time that you repeated that information, your knowledge of that information went back up, and that kind of makes sense. You're getting that information again as you did the first time. But what he saw was although there still is a forgetting curve after every one of those repetitions, that curve is actually more shallow. You begin to retain more and more of that information over time. So essentially, just as there is a forgetting curve, there also is a learning curve, and that learning is done through repetition. Let's say you have a lesson over some material, and then 10 days later, you're going to have a test. If you listen to that material on test day, you're only going to remember about 35% of that information. But if you went over that same information you had in the lecture the day after the lecture, by test day, you're actually going to remember about 64% of that information. And if you had 2 days later another repetition where you're going back over all the information again, now you're into 78%. You do another repetition, you get to 97%. That's what we want to do. So the question now is, how do we get repetitions? Well, teachers actually try to build in repetitions in the classroom. Before a lecture, a lot of times, as we'll discuss in a moment, we'll have you read a textbook. Then we're going to have a lesson, whether it's a lesson or a lecture in the classroom or it's a lecture on video such as this one. And then what we'll do is we'll have classroom activities where we're taking that information we have taught you and we're having you work with that information. Each time you're working with that information is coming back up in your memory. So that is how teachers help you get repetition. But then there is studying. And studying is what you do at home outside of what the teacher has told you to do, where you're going back over the material. Now, in order to help you study, we use Cornell Notes. That is what you're actually going to be studying in order to get those repetitions at home. So let's begin by talking about textbook reading. Now, there's many reasons why teachers, such as myself, will give you textbook reading to do. And what you're going to find a lot of times is I'm going to give you a textbook reading, and then I'm going to have a lecture over the same material later. Why? It's a repetition. But another reason why I do that is when you're doing a textbook reading, it gives you a baseline of information. This allows you during the lecture to sit back, listen to me, be able to think of questions and absorb the information more fully. It also allows me to go deeper into the material and be able to add different examples and different situations that the textbook didn't cover. And the other reason why we're having you read textbooks is because it is a critical skill that you will need in order to be successful in college. Now, the problem with textbook reading is you do not read a textbook like you would read a book like Harry Potter or The Hunger Games. See, those are novels, and novels are there to entertain, but the purpose of a textbook reading is different. In a textbook learning, it is about being able to learn specific information. So you're not going to read a textbook like you read a novel. And there's really 5 steps to reading a textbook. There is previewing, there's questioning, there's chunking, there's annotation, and there's reflecting. Let's start talking about previewing. First of all, The last thing I want you to do is just take your reading assignment and just begin from the first page and then go to the last page. That's not how you're going to read a textbook. The first thing I want you to do is go on and flip through the pages you're supposed to read and look at what's on the textbook. You're going to start looking at, okay, what are the section titles? What are the main ideas that are in the margins? You're going to be looking at, is there a vocabulary? At the end of that section, is there a list of questions that I need to be able to understand? What are the pictures? What are the diagrams? Basically, go through and get a sense of what you're about ready to read. Essentially, what you're doing is you're telling the brain, hey, heads up, here's what's coming to you. Now, when you're doing this preview, what I want you to do is start looking for the guides on how the publisher is trying to tell you what is important. What you're going to do is you're going to look at the margins. You're going to see, are there diagrams, charts, picture captions. Look at whether there's bolded words, are there underlined words, words in different colors. All these different things are how publishers are trying to tell you this is important. Now, once you've done the preview and now your brain kind of has an idea of what the type of information you're going to receive, what I want you to do is chunk your reading. And what I mean by chunking is I want you to be able to break your reading into smaller segments. And the best way to do this is think about taking your hand and put your hand over the textbook and only read about as much as your hand could be able to cover. So now we determine how much we're going to read in our chunk. Now what we're going to do is we're going to begin reading and we're going to annotate as we read. We're going to be essentially highlighting those pieces of information we believe are important. Now don't highlight everything. You should only highlight really no more than 20%. Now, how do you highlight? Well, if you actually own the book yourself and you're not going to try to sell it back, you can go on and take a highlighter and just highlight it. In fact, you actually can make notes off to the side as you do that. However, especially in high school, the textbooks actually belong to the school. We don't want you to do that. So here's what you can do is you actually can take Post-it notes. Take different types of color Post-it notes, and when you see something that's important, just take a Post-it note, make a little note about it, and put it by the place in the textbook where the information is. Now, when you've completed reading that chunk, you've highlighted, you've annotated everything you believe is important, what I want you to do is before you go to a next chunk is I want you to reflect on what you've read. We don't want you to be simply just skimming over your eyes over the words. What we really want you to do is to start to absorb and understand what you read. In this reflection, what I want you to do at the end of the chunk is stop and ask yourself, what did I just learn? Now, if you can explain what you just read, fantastic. Go on, read another chunk and do the same thing over and over and over. But if you find that after you get done reading a chunk, you can't really explain what you just read, then you want to go back and you want to read over that chunk of information again. And what you're going to do is essentially you're going to do the same process over and over, chunk by chunk throughout your reading assignment. The problem, though, is reading is not enough. You have to take notes. And one of the best ways to be able to take notes, and what we're going to require my students to do, is use Cornell Notes. Now, Cornell Notes are named after the university that it was founded at when a law professor realized that people were not doing very well in law classes. So they developed this style of doing notes, but more importantly, the style of studying notes. And now this has actually been adopted by major law schools throughout the country as the preferred note-taking method. Now, to get started, what you're going to do is you're going to take your piece of notebook paper and you're going to divide it into a right side and a left side. And an easy way to determine where that line should be is if you find that red margin, go on and take your 3 fingers, put those 3 fingers to the right of that red line, and then go on and draw that line where your fingers are. Now, with this divided page, you have a right side and left side. The right side is where we're going to be taking notes. On the left side is where we're going to be giving our reflections. We're going to be bringing vocabulary words over, and we're going to be asking questions. Now, what do we put in our notes? Well, remember those annotations we made while we're reading our textbook? That's what's going to go into your notes. Now, this becomes very easy when your textbook publisher has provided all those different guides, but not all textbooks are like that. So you may be struggling with, even during the annotation phase, of what really is important. So here's just a few guides for you to determine what is important that needs to go into your notes. First of all, if you have a definition or a keyword that the textbook is giving, you want to make sure that's in your notes. If you're talking about processes, what you want to capture is what do they do, and more importantly, why? Why does something work that way? If there's places, what you want to do is not only say what the places were, but you want to really focus on is why is that place important? And it's the same thing with people. really what you want to do is you want to list who those people are, but most importantly is you want to list why do we care about that person? If there are events, especially in history, you don't want to say that this happened on this date. What you want to do is capture why did this happen, and when this happened, what did it cause? You want to be able to talk about the cause and effect of your events and then list. If you have a list of different things within your textbook, these are very easy things to be able to have in questions on a test. You want to make sure you capture those lists. Now we can use the same strategy of determining what is important in our textbook to whenever we have a lecture. Except for in a lecture, we're also going to be listening to the teacher and the professor. If your teacher is repeating the same thing over a few times, you want to make sure that gets into your textbook. Obviously, if your teacher or professor says this is important, he's telling you or she's telling you that's important, make sure it's in your notes. Also, if your teacher has a mastery check. If there is after a lecture, they have a question about the lecture, you absolutely want to make sure that that's captured in your notes. Your teacher does everything in the classroom for a reason. You want to take those hints. Now, when you're taking notes on textbooks, what I suggest is go on putting the headings and the subheadings of your textbook into your notes. Why this is important is later on when you look at your notes and there's something in your notes that you're not quite sure what you really meant, you can easily go back to your textbook and find that section of where you're taking your notes. Now, when students are learning to take notes, there's something called the Goldilocks Effect that takes hold. Remember Goldilocks, you had the mama bear, papa bear, and baby bear. We don't want you to have mama bear notes. We don't want you to have papa bear notes. Mama bear notes is when you really don't have very much in your notes and you're skipping a lot of the key information that you're going to be needing to have for the test or be able to continue your learning. By the same time, we also don't want you to have Papa Bear notes. Papa Bear notes is when a student is trying to essentially rewriting the entire book. What we want you to do is have Baby Bear notes. Not too long, not too short. Where all you're trying to do is take the key information, which we talked about earlier, and be able to get that in your notes. It is Endnotes is the only time in my classroom I tell my students I do not want them writing in full sentences. In fact, I don't even need my students writing in full words. What we want you to be able to do is write your notes, capture that information as quickly as possible. So that means often when I take notes, I use abbreviations. I don't think I've ever actually written the word money in any of my notes ever. I just use the $sign. If it means equals, I'll put it equals. If I'm talking about something that's going up, I'll have an arrow going up. If something is declining, I'll have an arrow going down. If I'm talking about something causes something, I'll just have an arrow from what is the cause and to what is the effect. The bottom line is, as long as you understand what your symbols are, you use them. Now, the reason why we do this is because we don't want you spending hours and hours and hours writing your notes. We want you to pull out the important information and get it down into your notes as quickly as possible. So that's when a lot of students will say, okay, Mr. Rushoff, because I want to be able to take notes quicker, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a computer to take notes. I'm going to tell you, don't do this. Research has actually shown that when you have individuals handwrite something, the brain is more engaged with that information and it makes a more lasting impact upon the memory. So now we have our notes on the right side of our paper. Now it's a matter of determining how are we going to get those repetitions. Well, the first repetition should be within 20 minutes, ideally of when you take the notes. Maybe it's when you're packing up. Maybe it's right after your next class. Maybe it's during a passing period or lunch. But the bottom line is ideally really fairly soon after you take the notes, what we want you to do is just go through your notes. And here what you're trying to do is you're clarifying your abbreviation, your notes, you're reading over your notes, you're highlighting those key words or aspects you thought, okay, that really is important. You're identifying those concepts that you really didn't understand that's in your notes and you put a question mark on it. By the way, it is those question marks, those things that you didn't understand in the textbook or in the lecture that you took notes and you have a question mark by, that is what you should come to a tutorial or an office call with your professor or your teacher and say, okay, Mr. Rushoff, I had this in my notes, I didn't quite understand what it meant. That is how you are able to link what you have in your notes to being able to how to use tutorials and office calls successfully. Now, our second repetition, we want to have within 24 hours of the original time they actually wrote the notes. And here what we're going to do is for the first time, we're going to be putting things into the left side of our notes. First of all, any of your vocabulary words they have in your notes, what we want you to do is take those words, not the entire definition, just the words, and just write them in the left column across from where the definition is. Now, in addition to these vocabulary words, what we want you to do is use the same chunking procedure on your notes as we did for our textbook. And for each one of those chunks, what we want you to do is write 1 or 2 questions that is answered by those notes. But we want you to write good questions. We don't want you to write simple questions that can be simply answered by a definition or what is. After all, you've already pulled your vocabulary words over. If you have something like that, just use the vocabulary word. What we want you to do is use questions that use more complex thoughts. Ideally, those 1 or 2 questions over a chunk of your notes is a question that really makes sure that you understand everything in that chunk. Now, too often when students are writing summaries, really the summary doesn't say anything. I'll get something such as, this reading went over how mountains are caused by plate tectonics. That really doesn't tell anybody anything, and it doesn't make your mind get engaged with what you do. So here's how I teach how to write a summary for a Cornell Notes. What I want you to do is for each one of those questions in your notes that you had above, I want you to write a 1-sentence answer for each one of those questions. And what happens is that summary truly becomes a summary of everything that's in your notes. And not only that, quite frankly, it is another repetition as you're going back over your notes and you're working with that and your brain's engaged with that. Now, once you have your notes actually written, now what we have is we have our notes on our right side, we have notes on our left side, we have our summary for each one of our sections of the textbook. Now we can use these notes to study. This is how we get our 3rd, 4th, 5th, and every other repetition after that. And it becomes very, very simple. What I want you to do is take your notes and you're going to take a piece of paper and you're going to cover the right half. Now, you're not going to read your notes. What you're going to do is you're going to quiz yourself on those vocabulary words and those questions you have on your left side. If you get to a question or a vocabulary word that says, gosh, I don't know what psychological distance is, then what you do is you uncover your notes, you look at what it is, and then you recover and you keep on going on. This is an extremely quick way of being able to study your notes. Not only that, it is actively engaged with your notes. Essentially, when we're studying our notes, the way that we're talking about here with Cornell Notes, essentially we're making them into flashcards. What we want you to do is be engaged with your notes and use your notes to study. So here's what I want you to do. Within a unit, what you should be doing is going over all the notes for that unit every other day. Just go over it every other day. And again, you're just going over that left side and you're quizzing yourself. It's going to be very, very easy. And then what I want you to do is 10 minutes a week for each one of your classes. I want you to take all of your notes for that semester and go over all of your notes. Now that might sound like a lot, but the reality is, once again, is we're only going through over the left side and all we're doing is we're quizzing ourselves. And because you have had so many other repetitions, what you're going to start realizing was those notes from the first unit of the semester are very, very easy. You're blowing through those in maybe only about a minute or 2 minutes. And the reality is through all this repetition is how we're going to be able to move that information from your notes to knowledge. And that's what we want you to do. We want you to be successful. So we talked about in this lesson how you're able to read a textbook, how you're able to take notes over a textbook and lectures, and we talked about how you can study your notes to have academic success. All right, until our next lesson, keep on learning.